You didn't disappear. While everyone else kept moving, something kept interrupting you. You went into hiding, isolating. You told yourself you lost momentum, that you fell off, that you wasted time. But that's not what really happened. It wasn't just things going wrong. It was you pulling back without fully understanding why. Conversations started feeling unnecessary. Being around people felt draining in a way you couldn't explain. You chose distance more often, not out of fear, but because something in you stopped wanting to engage the same way. But don't worry, because there's a greater motive behind this. This isn't for someone who just feels different. That's too surface level. This is for the person who has had full conversations in their head that were sharper, more real, and more honest than anything anyone has said to them out loud. The kind of person who walks into a room and immediately reads everything, the tension, the hierarchy, who's pretending, who's uncomfortable, and chooses not to say anything, not because they're shy, but because there's nothing worth adding. You've been called intense by people who barely think, and confusing by people who never question anything. You've had moments where you tried to simplify yourself just to fit, and it felt like you were slowly erasing something important without knowing exactly what it was. And at some point, you stopped explaining yourself, not out loud, and not even internally. That's who this is for. And if that felt a little too accurate, then you already know this isn't random. But what most people don't realize is this: people like you don't go into hiding because they're lost. They go into hiding right before something shifts in a way they can't reverse. At some point, you stopped expecting things to be easy, not because someone told you to toughen up, but because life kept putting you in positions where no one was coming to fix it for you. You had to figure things out on your own, make decisions without guidance, carry situations that weren't even supposed to be yours to carry. And what's strange is, you didn't make a big deal out of it. You just adapted, quietly, repeatedly. You became the person who handles things, the one who doesn't break down in chaos, who can sit in uncomfortable situations without reacting, who can see what needs to be done and just do it. Not because you wanted that role, but because it kept falling on you. Over time, that does something to a person. It sharpens you, but it also isolates you. Because once you're used to handling everything alone, it becomes hard to relate to people who crumble over things you've already learned to carry without speaking about. And that's where the shift happened. You stopped looking for support in the same way, not out of pride, but because you realized most people couldn't meet you where you were. Strength didn't make you loud. It made you silent in places where others would have panicked. That silence wasn't emptiness. It was control. It was awareness. It was restraint. And once you reach that point, you don't just go back to being how you were before, because now you've seen what you're capable of when there's no one else to rely on, which leads to something most people never fully understand about people like you. There has always been a certain type of person in every generation who doesn't fit into what's already built, not because they're broken or lost, but because the structure around them was never designed with them in mind. And if you look back at your own experience, it was never just about not fitting in socially. It was deeper than that. It was the feeling that even when you tried to align yourself with what was expected, something still felt off, like you were forcing yourself into a shape that wasn't yours. That's not confusion, that's incompatibility. Most people assume that if you don't fit, you need to adjust, learn the rules, adapt, blend in. But there's another possibility that almost no one considers. What if you weren't meant to fit into anything that already exists? Because every era quietly produces people who don't align with the current structure. Not late, but early. Not behind, but ahead of something that hasn't fully formed yet. You didn't fail to find your place. Your place simply hasn't been built yet. And that changes everything. Because now, your past doesn't look like rejection. It looks like misalignment. It looks like being placed in environments that were never meant to hold you long term. That's why nothing fully stuck. That's why every attempt to settle into something familiar eventually felt wrong, even if it looked right on the surface. And once you start seeing it like this, something clicks. You stop asking, "What's wrong with me?" And you start realizing you were never supposed to match what was already here in the first place. Even when you stepped back, even when you went quiet, that part of you didn't disappear. It just stopped being visible. You still notice things other people walk past without thinking twice. Small details, patterns, inconsistencies, things that don't stand out to anyone else, but immediately register for you. You still feel shifts in energy, tone, intention, without anyone needing to say a word. And those moments when everything is quiet, late at night, when there's nothing distracting you, you still get those thoughts, clear ideas, realizations that come out of nowhere, fully formed, like they've been waiting for you to slow down enough to hear them. That never left, and neither did that frustration. The one you feel when you see something being done poorly, inefficiently, or without awareness, and you instantly know how it could be better. You don't always say it anymore, but you still see it every time. Your gift didn't disappear, it just stopped performing for people who couldn't recognize it. That's the difference. Because if it was gone, you wouldn't notice any of this. You wouldn't feel that pull. You wouldn't have those moments where something inside you wakes up for a second and reminds you of what you're capable of. But it's still there, quiet, but intact. And the fact that it survived without being used, without being validated, without being seen, that's not weakness, that's proof. And now, it's time for today's comment. Trusting that what's meant to become clear will. There's something calm about that mindset. Not everything needs to be figured out right now. Some things take time to reveal themselves, and forcing clarity too early can actually create more confusion. Trusting that things will become clear is a different kind of patience, not passive, but steady. It lets you keep moving without needing every answer up front. Thank you for sharing this. At some point, you realized that saying everything you see isn't always useful. Not because you're wrong, but because you can already predict how it's going to be received. You can see the reactions before they happen, the misunderstandings before they're spoken, the resistance before it even shows up. So instead of pushing through that every time, you started choosing your moments. You started filtering. You let certain things go, not because they didn't matter, but because you knew the outcome wouldn't justify the effort. And that's where it slowly shifted. What started as awareness turned into restraint. What started as precision turned into silence. You stopped correcting things you could clearly see were off. You stopped stepping in when you knew you could handle a situation better. You let conversations pass, let decisions unfold, let people believe what they wanted, even when you knew exactly where it was leading. You didn't stay quiet because you had nothing to say. You stayed quiet because you already saw what would happen if you did. But over time, that kind of control comes with a cost, because the more you hold back, the more you start operating below your natural level. You start navigating life in a way that keeps things smooth, but not accurate. You avoid friction, but you also avoid impact. And eventually, that creates a tension you can't fully ignore. Not loud, not obvious, but constant. A quiet awareness that you're not fully expressing what you're capable of, that you're reducing your presence just enough to keep everything stable, even if it means things stay limited. There are moments where you feel it clearly, when you hear something and immediately know there's a deeper layer no one is addressing. When you watch something unfold and realize You could shift the entire situation with a few words, but you don't. Not because you can't, because you choose not to. You didn't become smaller, you just became more controlled than the environment required. And now, you're at a point where that control is starting to feel unnecessary. Not wrong, but outdated, because the same awareness that taught you when to stay quiet is now showing you when staying quiet is the only thing holding you back. There's a reason your experience has never felt simple, even when your life looked normal on the outside. You don't just feel things, you understand them. And you don't just think, you break things down in ways most people don't even attempt. That combination creates a very specific kind of pressure, because you can see the emotional layer of a situation and the logical structure behind it at the same time. You can understand why someone feels the way they do and still recognize where they're wrong. You can step back from your own emotions and analyze them while you're still inside them. That's not common, and it changes how you move through everything. It makes surface-level interactions feel empty. It makes predictable patterns feel exhausting. It makes you lose interest in things that once held your attention, not because you're bored, but because you've already seen through them. You don't experience life at face value, you experience what's underneath it. And that creates distance, not because you're trying to separate yourself, but because most people aren't operating at that level of awareness at the same time. So you end up in this position where you can understand almost everyone, but very few people truly understand you. And when that goes on long enough, something shifts. You stop trying to be fully seen. You stop explaining every thought, every realization, every perspective. Not because you can't, but because you already know how it's going to land. There's a subtle line that gets crossed without you realizing it. At first, you adjust slightly. You overlook small things. You accept certain behaviors, certain environments, certain conversations, not because they fully align with you, but because they're manageable, because it's easier than constantly resisting everything that feels off. And for a while that works. It keeps things smooth. It keeps things moving. It avoids unnecessary tension. But over time, those small adjustments start stacking. You tolerate more than you used to. You stay in conversations longer than you should. You give attention to things that don't deserve it. And none of it feels extreme enough to question until you step back and realize how far it's drifted from what actually fits you. You didn't lose your standards. You slowly adjusted them to match what was around you. That's how it happens. Gradually, quietly, without a clear moment where you can say, this is where it changed. And the problem with that isn't just what you're tolerating, it's what you're no longer expecting. Because the more you adapt downward, the more your baseline shifts. What once felt off now feels normal. What once wouldn't have lasted now becomes something you stay in longer than you should. And at a certain point, that creates a kind of internal disconnect. You start feeling out of place, but you can't immediately explain why. You just know something isn't fully right. That's not confusion. That's misalignment showing up again. You don't create alignment by adjusting to everything. You create it by becoming selective about what stays. And that's the shift. Not forcing change, not cutting everything off, not becoming distant for the sake of it, but becoming precise. You start paying attention to what actually matches your level of awareness, your level of thinking, your level of presence. You stop giving energy to things just because they're available. You stop staying in places just because they're familiar. And the moment you do that, something becomes very clear. You were never asking for too much. You were just surrounded by things that were never meant to meet you at your level in the first place. There's a quiet pressure that tries to settle in when you look back at that period of your life. The idea that maybe you lost time, that while you were paused, while things felt slow or unclear, Everyone else was advancing, building, gaining something you didn't. But if you strip that thought down, it doesn't actually hold weight, because most of what people were moving through wasn't clarity. It was momentum without direction. It just looked convincing because it was visible. You didn't miss opportunities. You missed obligations disguised as opportunities. You missed paths that would have demanded your time, your energy, your focus, only for you to realize later that they were never aligned with you in the first place. And the truth is, most people don't recognize that until they're already deep into something they don't fully want anymore. You didn't fall behind. You avoided commitments that would have cost you more later. Because moving fast doesn't mean moving correctly. And being involved in everything doesn't mean you're getting closer to where you actually need to be. While you were out of that cycle, something else was happening quietly. You weren't being pulled into decisions just because they were available. You weren't being pressured into choosing directions just to feel like you were progressing. Instead, your path stayed open, unlocked, uncommitted. And that's rare, because most people lock themselves into something too early, out of pressure, out of fear, out of comparison. There's a pattern in your life that's easy to overlook if you don't pay attention to it directly. You don't naturally move with the crowd, even when you try to, even when it would make things simpler. Something in you resists following paths that are already established, already explained, already validated by everyone else. And it's not rebellion, it's not ego, it's not a need to stand out, it's recognition. You see where things are going before they fully get there. You notice the direction of people, situations, and systems before it becomes obvious. And once you see it, it becomes difficult to pretend you don't. You don't move differently to be different. You move differently because you can already see the outcome. That's why following feels unnatural. Not because you can't, but because it would require you to ignore what you already understand. And that creates a kind of tension that most people don't experience. Because moving first doesn't come with confirmation. It doesn't come with reassurance. It doesn't come with visible proof that you're making the right decision. It comes with uncertainty. It comes with making a move when nothing around you is fully supporting it yet. It comes with trusting something internal that hasn't been validated externally. That's uncomfortable. And that's exactly why you've hesitated at times. Not because you didn't know what to do, but because you knew that once you acted on it, there was no going back to not knowing. You weren't waiting for clarity, you were delaying responsibility. Because once you move first, you set a direction. And once that direction is set, others start to recognize it later. They start to follow it, adapt to it, build on it. But you were the one who had to move without seeing that outcome yet. And that's the role you keep finding yourself in, quietly, repeatedly, not as someone who leads loudly or demands attention, but as someone who initiates movement without needing validation. And here's the part that matters now. If you don't move when you already see what's ahead, nothing changes. Not for you, and not for anything connected to you. You just sit in awareness without action, and that eventually turns into frustration. Because that clarity you have isn't passive. It's directional. It's meant to be used. You're not here to wait until it's obvious. You're here to act before it is. And if you're still here, still listening, I genuinely appreciate it. If any part of this connected with you, even in a small way, then take that seriously. Not as something you need to overthink, but as something worth noticing. Because moments like this don't happen often. You don't need to rush back into anything. You don't need to prove anything. And you definitely don't need to become someone else just to move forward. Just move in a way that feels honest to where you are right now. That's enough. And whatever comes next for you, trust that you're not stepping into it the same way you would have before.